Last year, I decided to stop growing vegetables in my new polytunnel space in order to deal with a few problematic issues. The plants last spring didn't do very well, and there were some deficiencies apparent in the crops, and there were signs of a viral disease in the tomato plants. I also felt that I didn't have enough compost to adequately prepare the soil in these garden beds for the level of production that I wanted. So I decided to pull the crops, remineralize the soil, and sow a green manure or cover crop in order to build the soil organic matter, improve the soil biology, as well as improve the soil texture. I don't have a lot of experience in growing this type of crop cover in my gardens, but it's something that I'm really interested in exploring a lot more. And I've never grown a green manure in the protected climate of a polytunnel, especially over the winter, and it was interesting to see how it all turned out. My plans were further set back by severe fire damage to the polytunnel, after which the entire sheet of plastic had to be replaced. I took the opportunity to level the bed some more and to clear out a lot of the weeds, and I added a range of concentrated fertility and mineral amendments, including a lot of chicken manure. This was all part of the process of starting to fully remineralize and balance the fertility of the soil, based on detailed soil tests. It was late autumn by the time I sowed a mix of green manure seed, which was specifically developed for overwintering in the Irish climate, and included wild rye, black or Japanese oats, vetch, and 2 types of clover. Because I had added so much chicken manure to the soil, I was not so concerned about the nitrogen fixing capacity of this green manure, but some more would definitely be good. I was much more interested in growing carbon and building organic matter both above and below the soil. I was also interested in growing plants with strong, vigorous root systems, which would work to improve the structure of the soil, both within the topsoil and deeper in the soil profile. And a big part of this was to bring life back into the soil, to boost the soil ecosystem. After broadcast sowing the seeds and working them shallowly into the soil, I set up a drip line watering system back onto the beds. I then finished off the preparations of the growing space by adding wood chips into the paths between the growing beds. It was really good to see this growing space clean and well established, especially after the problematic events of this season. The growth of the green manure was slow at first, but the young plants grew steadily over the winter, which was not too cold, and the polytunnel offered protection from the windy weather. As expected, the growth rate accelerated in the early spring as temperatures began to rise again, with the longer days and more sunlight. It became quite an amazing stand of vegetation, quickly reaching knee-high and then waist-high, and some sections and plants going even higher. But the growth wasn't even across the full garden, indicating possible differences in the underlying soil fertility or soil structure, and a mold developed on the leaves of the rye or oats, especially at one end of the polytunnel space. This indicated to me that something was not quite right, though I'm not sure what it was, but the humid conditions and lack of strong air movement in the enclosed space probably contributed to this issue. There was also lots of other plant species mixed in, including the various types of annual weeds that are typical in my gardens, as well as a lot of leafy brassica plants which had self-seeded and cross-pollinated when this growing space was abandoned a number of years ago. I think that the more diverse range of species can only help, so long as I can get rid of the plants when I need to. One of the big issues with green manures is how to get rid of these typically strong and vigorous plants so that we can grow other crops. Green manures like this are traditionally dug or plowed in, or chopped up with a flail mower in order to both kill off the plants and to incorporate the carbon and nutrient-rich biomass into the soil for quick decomposition. I have wanted to transition this polytunnel into a minimum till or no-dig growing space, with only minor surface cultivation from now on, so digging wasn't a preferred option and I don't have access to a flail mower. But I was planning to cover this entire garden space with a ground cover fabric, with holes in it for tomatoes, cucumbers, and other crops. And I figured I could simply cut the strong growth of vegetation and leave it on the surface of the soil to decompose over time underneath the ground cover fabric. With this fabric, preventing the regrowth of the plants would be relatively easy, but I still had to figure out a way to cut or flatten or trample all of the vegetation, and I figured that the best option was to use my scythe to cut it all down. As I wanted to allow as much biomass to grow as possible, I waited quite late until a lot of the plants were starting to flower, and then I used my scythe to slowly and carefully cut the dense growth of plants. I was extra careful along the edge of the space to avoid cutting into the plastic, and I managed to do the full job without a scratch. But I wasn't careful enough to avoid the drip line watering pipes and sliced through the pipes a few times, but thankfully they're quite easy to repair. It probably would have been better to take the time to pull out all the lengths of dripline pipe entirely. Or in hindsight, I should have installed an overhead sprinkler system instead when I originally sowed the green manure, which would have made the whole process easier. I laid all of the cut material or hay onto the garden beds and then covered the full garden with the sheets of ground cover fabric that already had holes in them from the previous season for the plants that I wanted to grow. For the beds that I was planning to transplant into right away, I moved a lot of the hay onto the paths adjacent to the bed to make it easier for transplanting, and I figured that the material would be broken up and crushed as I walked back and forth, which I think would have speeded up the decomposition. In hindsight, I probably should have done this right away with all of the hay material to crush it and mash it underfoot for a while before putting it back onto the beds, which I think would have really helped. I then marked out the location of each hole, pulled back the ground cover fabric, and then dug over the stations for each plant, chopping up the remains of the green manure stems and the root systems in the process. While this was going against my preference for reduced cultivation, it was only a small portion of the volume of soil, and it made it a lot easier to transplant the tomatoes through the holes in the ground cover fabric once I put it back in place. When the plants were a little bit more established, I lifted up the edges of the ground cover fabric and scraped the crushed remains of the green manure material back onto the bed, where I figured it would act as a type of side dressing for these heavy feeding plants during the growing season. As the plants grew bigger, it was interesting to see the roots growing right into the area where the decomposing biomass was touching the surface of the soil. This mulch under the ground cover fabric allowed the roots of the tomato plants to colonize the whole volume of soil and then some. Unfortunately, a short time after transplanting, the tomato plants were showing signs of nitrogen deficiency, indicated by a pale discoloration of the older leaves. It was only then that I realized that most of the nitrogen that was in the soil had been incorporated into the roots and the leaves of the green manure. I had thought that a fair amount of the fertility would have remained in the soil, but apparently most of it was taken up in the strong growth of these green manure crops. And the process of decomposition hadn't started to release the nitrogen yet, or at least not fast enough for what these young tomato plants needed. I fed these plants with a liquid feed of a high nitrogen fertilizer, and then foliar fed them a few times over the next few weeks, and a month later they were growing really strongly. In hindsight, I should have provided a liquid feeding while transplanting, and it would have been even better if I'd mixed in some compost when I dug the stations for each plant. And I made sure to take these precautions with the other plants that I transplanted a few weeks later. I assumed that cutting the green manure material a few weeks earlier would have partially alleviated this issue, but it would have been even better to have dug the green manure into the soil in the first place, which would have sped up the decomposition and released the nitrogen and other nutrients closer to the roots of the tomato plants. Of course, digging it in would have further delayed getting the possible benefits of a no-dig soil ecosystem in these beds. But even partially digging it in would have helped to speed up the transition from green manure to crop. No doubt this blanket of biomass will continue to feed the soil biology and plants with a gradual release of nitrogen, carbon, and other nutrients over the long growing season, rather than a quick flush of fertility at the beginning of the season. I suspect that this slow and steady decomposition is probably a good thing, but it's something that I definitely want to keep an eye on as the growing season progresses. Overall, I still think it was beneficial to take the time to grow a green manure to help to improve the quality of the soil in this valuable growing space. But of course, it would have been even better if I had established the beds and then grown a green manure for at least a year before putting up the polytunnel in the first place. But growing in the shelter of the polytunnel did allow a lot more biomass to be produced in a cold part of the year, and it could have grown an even wider range of species. Using a sprinkler watering system instead of a drip line would have made everything easier, and it would have prevented the hay from drying out, which would have helped to speed up the decomposition. If I was to do it again, I would consider using a mulcher or a lawnmower to cut the green manure a few times while it was growing, or even scything it a few times. A more gradual buildup of organic matter on the surface of the soil in layers over time might have worked better, and it would have avoided the huge amount of biomass at the end. Or I could have cut the green manure a few weeks or even a month earlier to allow the decomposition and soil to settle before transplanting. But this would have significantly reduced the amount of organic matter that this crop of green manure would have been able to produce, which was one of the main reasons for growing it in the first place. No doubt there's a balance there somewhere, or a more suitable method, in trying to grow as much organic material as possible without negatively affecting the following crop, and I'm not sure that I found it on my first try. This video was all about growing a green manure in a polytunnel and then getting rid of the green manure so that I could grow another crop. I'm planning to make another video in the near future where I'm going to explore the question about whether it was worth growing the green manure in the first place, compared to other options that I might have had. If you're interested in this kind of thing, keep an eye out for that video and perhaps subscribe if you haven't already. This process of trying things out and then questioning and wondering whether it was worth it or how to be able to do it better is a big part of this Red Gardens project. If you value this approach and want to support me in this endeavor, I've identified a few options in the description below. Any financial support that you can give would be greatly appreciated. But the biggest support that you can give is, of course, continuing to watch my videos, and thank you for making it all the way to the end of this one.